we still have all these other folks here, even though they're not. But so we have, you know, a definition of God, but you don't have to use God. You could use any noun to replace it, really, that is a very general, abstract kind of concept, to say that there has to be something than which nothing greater can be conceived. And that's just like, you know, this is a cup. There are bigger cups, you know. Your cup is bigger, right, than this cup, you know, and it's, you know, so we have a sense of degrees, right? And that was one of Aquinas's 4 ways. His arguments is that there's a gradation of things, and there has to be a greatest and a smallest. And in fact, we know what we want to call the smallest. We call it the Planck constant, in which nothing can be conceived. Although that's not something that Mr. Planck ever called it. And then there's the universe itself, which we think of as a certain size, thanks to the way they can measure space. And so they have a conception of how incredibly huge it is, unless there's other dimensions of space that we're not aware of, even though we might guess about them, but they might be out there. But the idea that something uniquely powerful that's enabled all this to happen is something that we seem to have to believe. And then it's connected to the way things behave in nature, because obviously whatever made the universe made everything in nature. And so nature behaves according to the algorithms this power set up, right? So we're, whether you're calling it a religious belief or you're calling it science, actually, makes no real difference.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the Middle Ages, of course, that was the only vocabulary they had. Right? And in fact, they were creating vocabulary as they went. But if you look at it from that point of view, you can see that what people have been doing is just refining the way we think, including mathematics, or, you know, the way we look at physics, and so on. In fact, the moderns, which we're starting tonight with Descartes and Thomas Hobbes, would be the 2 I picked. But there are others, of course. They're not alone in their development. They are considered significant because of the change in vocabulary that they introduce, which makes it science instead of religion. And yet, when you look at them, they're very careful to still pay their respects to the vocabulary of religion. For one thing, because in their day, religion was a very powerful authority, right? And you know, if you got in trouble with the religious authorities, you could be in serious trouble. I mean, some of the famous new ideas caused people to be burned at the stake, you know, and including, I know one of them, Bruno. If you ever heard of Bruno, he was burned at the stake in this Plaza of Flowers in Rome. There's even a plaque there where the stake was, so that you could go and say, oh, that's where he was burned at the stake. And Bruno got in trouble because he said, you know, the stars are really far away. The Muslim Times, see, they're fond of making Christians look pretty awkwardly primitive They actually burned their scientists. And they did. Giordano Bruno. And when you get right down to it, the main thing was that he said that the stars are really, really far away, and they're huge, just like our sun. And people thought he was so outrageously crazy that they condemned him for those weird beliefs and burned him at the stake.
Wow, just for making an observation.
And yeah, and when you, I mean, that was heresy. By the way, you're a heretic. And you are too, because you're Americans, right? Yes. And by definition of what heresy is, all Americans grow up to be officially heretics, whether they even realize it or not. Because heresy means that you think you could choose what you believe. And by the way, don't all Americans grow up believing that, yes, I am free to choose whatever religion suits me, or none, if that's the case? That's exactly the way Americans are taught, because there's a separation of church and state. The state can't make you believe a particular religion. And as a result, we are all subject to what is referred to as the heretical imperative. Which is a book by one of my favorite authors. That's the picture of it. That's a really old copy. They have new copies of it too. But the basic point of that is, it's just a little book, but he basically points out that what heresy is believing that you can think for yourself and choose your own religion. And guess what? By definition, as Americans, I joined the army and they asked me, what religion are you? You have to pick, from like 5 or 6. Because they have to put it on your dog tag. So that when, you get shot and you're dead, that the right chaplain gives you the right rights for whatever you pick. So it's on your dog tags.
So if you pick none, you get none.
None for you, yeah. I don't remember I think none was a choice. I don't think they had atheism on there. I think, you could be like Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, non-denominational, which was actual services. When I was in a few places, they had what were called non-denominational services, where they had a Protestant minister who didn't necessarily announce his affiliation, whether he was Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Lutheran, whatever.
It's a lot of religions.
Well, it's interesting that they can have a service that seems to apply to anyone that's not fundamentalist, but that they're not Catholic, they're not Orthodox, like Byzantine or Greek or
The weird
Russian.
one when I was in basic religion, well, one religion in particular, what's the word? They basically said, the Wiccans, right?
The Wiccans.
Said, we would like to be able to have a service for, troops and basic.
Unitarians do that.
And they were like, oh, okay, I guess. And so the Wiccan service became very popular because part of their service was meditation. Close your eyes and just meditate deeply. And in basic training, if you could get an opportunity to take a nap without getting chewed out, you're all for it. So yeah, the Wiccan service was one for people who weren't like devoutly religious. They were like, I think I'm a Wiccan. I'm gonna go to that one. Let's take a pick.
Take a nap.
Take your pick.
But we got into this because of the idea that how on earth did we all end up believing in God? Well, I think, the reason we might think it's weird to believe in God is because a lot of the American religions were homegrown by people that didn't really have much education. And they created very fundamentalist religions where they think that the way they read the Bible is the correct interpretation, even though they haven't had enough of an education to know the history of it. I remember once I had a young UAA student in my office who was, absolutely amazed at all the books I had in my office. At the time, I had shelves, and I had a lot of my books from home I had in my office. And she said, I don't understand why you're reading all these books. You just have to read the Bible. And I said, well, I have the Bible, and I said, this is, the Oxford Study version, right? And she said, oh, well, I just read the original, the King James. And I said, the King James is a translation. She said, no, she didn't realize that Jesus did not speak English. It's like,
Yeah.
so I'm assuming she goes to a church where people don't realize, that the Old Testament was in Hebrew, or at least ended up in Hebrew before it was translated into other languages like Koine Greek. That's there's just, and there's four main religions that are considered homegrown American religions. Those are the ones that are inspired by William Miller. And those religions are those, what he was fascinated with was the second coming. And
That's my dad, Seventh-day Adventist.
he figured, so that's one of the four that were based on the latter days, right? These are the latter days. So the Latter-day Saints, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Shakers. But there are other variants too, because those are they're like homegrown. They're not based on religions of the European countries that kind of sent missionaries and along with the colonists that gave us the Anglican Church, for example, or the Lutheran Church, or the Methodists were pretty important. The Methodists were actually Anglicans that kind of dumbed down their sermons for folks that did not have much of an education, because the Anglican Church in England really is catering primarily to the elite, the noble classes in England, and not the poorer people. And as a result, by the way, they're dying out right now because there's not very many people that believe in the faith in England anymore. So in fact, there's more active believers of Islam in England than there are in the Anglican Church. So that's kind of amazing. Things are changing. And by the way, France is the same way. So, America is like the place where you find more Christians. But what kind of Christians are we? We're kind of, kind of inspired by this guy, who basically, he knew how to read, and as he's reading the book, he's convinced he understands, the secret messages that are in the book, right? But, you could go back, obviously, in history, as we've been doing, as we talked about the Middle Ages. St. Augustine, Aquinas, they're just two landmark kind of pillars of the Middle Ages. Augustine, kind of the end of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages, and Aquinas is kind of the end of scholasticism, right? So, and as I mentioned, Aquinas is essentially still the dogma of the church because it presents a way of handling the faith that goes with the Christian dogma and merging it with advances in science. So as science develops, you adjust the faith, which really caused the Reformation, or at least one of the reasons it caused the Reformation, was because people like this guy, who was an Augustinian, a member of the Order of St. Augustine, so a monk following the rule that was essentially based on the work of St. Augustine. But you're of course looking at over 1,000 years, roughly 1,000 years after St. Augustine. But he's a PhD. I mean, he's a professor of theology. And he ended up having his own views that were contrary to the views of the Vatican, the Pope, and especially with regard to taking money from the poor. Because his parish were very poor people in Germany, and he wanted the best for his people, and they kept sending preachers to come and scare the people into giving up their money, because the Pope was trying to build the Vatican, that the biggest basilica in the world. Well, it's not, but at the time he was trying to outbuild the cathedral in Köln, because that was the biggest one, and he was upset that the Archbishop of Köln had a bigger cathedral than he did, so he was trying to outbuild it, and that's the one where Michelangelo and others are the architects and the artists and everything. It was expensive, and so he was basically begging, trying to get money from the people. And Luther nailed his 95 Theses. Right? Are you familiar with any of that story? So he was upset, so he nailed 95 statements, basically, against the church onto the bulletin board of his university. And it got printed, because they now have the printing press, and so it got spread throughout. So this is criticisms of the Pope. And so, of course, it became a big furor. They were telling him that he had to withdraw his writings or he was in trouble, and he refused. But he had political protection from the German princes that were basically on his side and glad to have a variant of the church that would not be, force them to do whatever the Pope wanted. So it eventually ended up in a war between the Catholics and what became known as the Lutherans. And you ended up with a Lutheran church, which was not actually what Luther intended. He was trying to reform the church, right? But, instead of that happening, instead of that happening, you ended up with the protests, right? They protesting the church, so you ended up with the Protestants, right? And Lutherans were one of them. One of Martin Luther's, I guess we could call him a friend or colleague, is John Calvin. And They're all handsome-looking gents. By the way, Martin Luther was celibate before the church Reformation, and one of the things that happened was one of the nuns that he rescued during the strife ended up giving up her being a nun and married him. And so he ended up married and had, I think, 5 or 6 kids. So I don't know if John Calvin got married, but he created his own church, which is referred to as the Calvinists or the Presbyterian. You could call it the Presbyterian. And the main thing there is the presbyters, the members of kind of the church council, who are lay individuals, vote on what their churches believe and how they choose their ministers and so on. So the Calvinist religion, his foundation of the church was in Geneva, Switzerland. But along with John Calvin, one of the followers of John Calvin was John Knox, who was Scottish.
They all look the same.
I'm wondering, that's John Calvin. I guess that's kind of interesting.
And then Luther is just like a wider-faced, non-bearded version.
Yeah.
He did grow a beard. He did grow a beard.
Just not in his painting.
There's
That's the form.
so John Knox was Scottish, and so he took the Reformation to Scotland, so he's the founder of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland.
That's just crazy how like all these religions came about by, I don't know, like debates or revolutions or.
Right, and then the kind of the oddest one is the Church of England was founded by King Henry VIII because he was originally a supporter of the Catholic Church. In fact, he wrote a book in defense of the Catholic Church against the reformers, but he ended up married to Catherine of Aragon, who was the Princess of Spain, daughter of the King Ferdinand of Spain. That was supposed to unify, connect England and Spain, right? And the problem was she didn't have a male child that made King Henry happy with who was going to take the throne when he died. So he ended up falling in love with a courtesan, Anne, who he ended up wanting to marry, Anne Boleyn. I don't know, are you familiar with that at all? And so he wanted a divorce. And he didn't really have grounds for a divorce, but he thought, hey, I'm king, I ought to get what I want. So he told the Pope, give me a divorce or else. Well, but the Pope was actually surrounded by the forces of her father at the time, and her father was not interested in a divorce, and so the Pope said no, obviously. And so King Henry declared that the Church of England was no longer part of Rome, the Catholic Church, and it was its own church, and he basically stole all the church property and all the money, got rid of a lot of the priests and the monks and everything, unless you switched over, right? And then granted himself his divorce, by the way, and ended up marrying Anne Boleyn, and she only lasted 1,000 days before he declared that she was having an affair instead of being a good wife. But she did have Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, of course, becomes the queen eventually, Elizabeth first. But Mary was the first one. That was the daughter of the Spanish princess, the first marriage. So Mary became queen first, but tried to kill Elizabeth, but instead Elizabeth killed her. And so you ended up with Elizabeth, the Queen Elizabeth of England. But meanwhile, the king had declared it an Anglican church, so you ended up with an Anglican church. But along comes Charles I, who made it back to a Catholic church, but that caused a civil war, and then you ended up with a Puritan, I'm going to get that wrong, Puritan, I guess, the Puritans ended up, so very complicated at that time. And in fact, that's when we come in with one of the two individuals I wanted to look at tonight, and that's Thomas Hobbes.
He's different looking.
This guy is famous.
Yeah, but then they all look like that for the next 100 years.
Yeah, they wear black clothing with white collars.
Yeah.
The folks in the Netherlands did that too.
Scowl face.
Yeah, that's very Calvinist, I think. But Hobbes, notice he lived to 91, and yet his most famous line is that life is nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, there's a couple other words for it, but so I guess we could look. It's nasty, brutish, and short. Oh, that's the same. I could have just stayed where I was and looked for it, right? I didn't hit the right.
Control F.
There it is. So the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's too many words to remember. So everybody just remembers nasty, brutish, and short.
That's one long rant.
But I mean, the thing is, he lived 91, so his life wasn't short. Neither was it nasty or brutish or solitary or poor. He's none of that, right? So that's what strikes me as really funny. In fact, he's playing tennis in his retirement, in his late 80s and stuff.
Best fire and brimstone creatures in history, the Calvinists.
So why is Hobbes significant, and why is Descartes significant? They're both contemporaries, although Hobbes was born before Descartes and died afterwards. Descartes only lived 50 some years, as you can see. Instead of 91, he was 53 when he died. So first Descartes, famously Descartes, who's considered to be the first of the moderns. And what makes him modern? Well, I mean, he was, among other things, notice he does not become a preacher. He's not a monk or a scholastic, and yet he was educated, highly educated by Jesuits. So he was in a school where he could very easily have become a priest or a monk, but instead he was not going to go in that direction. Although he probably worked for the Jesuits. One of the really neat books that I really enjoyed. Okay, I'll get rid of Bruno here. Sorry about him. You can see the time period though. So this is a very dangerous time period if you're coming up with ideas that are different than the church. But who was I going to mention? Descartes. Someone else I should mention, of course, is Galileo. Put him in among all of this. But there was someone I was just mentioning besides Hobbes and Descartes.
The Frenchman?
Yeah, Descartes the Frenchman.
I think it was like something he wrote or something.
Oh, I was going to mention A.C. Grayling. That's what I was going to do. So A.C. Grayling and Descartes, he has a book, this one, The Life and Times of a Genius. Grayling is considered a genius too, by the way. So the book Descartes has a really neat hypothesis based on his research that seemed really pretty good to me, anyway. And that was that he ended up becoming a spy for the Jesuits. He of course, was connected to the Jesuits because of his education by them. But when he eventually joins the military for the French, and when his term of service is over, and by the way, while he's in the military, he's part with their artillery, because they now have gunpowder and cannons. And if you've ever fired a cannon, you know that the trajectory is going to go in an arc like this. Right? So assume you're here with the cannon. Boom. However you have a cannon. And over here is the, oh shit, people that are on the receiving end, of the cannonball. Right? Sorry, that's not normally how you express that, I guess, but.
I think that's how they would say it.
It's
Yeah,
shit.
yeah. Run away, run away. The kind of Monty Python. If you ever see the cow come flying, as the cat had pulled a cow over the, just absolutely silly stuff. But this is a new thing. And you have to use mathematics to figure out where this is going to be and what kind of aspects of the terrain, hill height, and so on is all going to be part of that. And if you've ever seen the maps from before Descartes, which, by the way, it's very puzzling. I remember how I always love messing with names. But Descartes means map. It's not my fault. It's just true. If you talk about the Cartesian mapping system, right? And are you familiar with that at all? Cartesian mapping system. Right, so you get this X, Y. Descartes invented that. In fact, he's. Pardon?
He's the one we have to blame now.
Yes. Theoretically, from what I understand, he was lying in bed and he saw a fly on his ceiling. And he thought up that if he had mapped out the ceiling in these squares, he could figure out exactly where that fly was and where it was, how it moved around. So, thanks to a fly on the ceiling, we've got the Cartesian coordinate system, which you can also use then as a way to map terrain. So you go to modern, well, of course there's other aspects of this, besides doing this kind of stuff, but you can also go back to, I'm going to have to search my brain here. I know this. It's the Fra-Moro map. I remembered it. Isn't that amazing? I'm amazed. That's I don't know about you, but I'm pretty darn amazed. This is. I actually have printed off a copy of this and framed it, although it doesn't have. It's missing a couple, because I've got it on a rectangle, 14 by 17, so it doesn't really do this justice. This, the original, is like a full wall, 7 foot by, whatever. But if you could look close enough, notice this is the Mediterranean. Here's Italy. Here's Spain. Hey.
Smartboard must have touched it.
I must have came too close. But so notice, here's Africa. This is right side up. By the way, these little red areas here are like paragraphs of writing telling you what it is. And this is the right side up. So first thing you notice, of course, is that by comparison with today's maps, it's upside down. Right? That's pretty weird. The other thing is, notice how big the ocean is.
Very small.
And that you realize why they called the planet Earth, even though most of it is water. Because they didn't know that most of it was water. Right? That took Magellan, really, to discover how much water there was. Right? Because Magellan was the one that first circumnavigated the globe. Right? At least from the European. Who knows? Who else might have done stuff like that? I mean, obviously the people living on all the islands in the Pacific had a pretty good idea how big the Pacific was, I would say. But so it's also kind of amazing that they thought the ocean was so short. No wonder Columbus thought he could just go and come out over here. Well, obviously he was wrong. They did know that it was circular, that it was a globe. But, that's the way they did that. But if you this map is considered to be really amazing, considering how much information it's got on there. It's about 50 years before Columbus. But if you think about it, say 1450, remember Columbus, when did Columbus sail the ocean blue?
1492.
There you go. Fra-Moro. So this is kind of amazing. But when you look, of course, at what maps start to look like afterwards, they end up with square boxes that are all the same size. And then you can measure even smaller boxes inside. So basically you get the idea that you can mathematically, accurately depict the surface of the Earth. Right? So that's kind of an amazing result of Descartes. It's also when they begin clocks. And the mechanical clocks, there's a neat movie called Mind Walk.